How do you act when the squeeze is on? Hi, Bill Wright here. Romans 12 tells us that at different times in life, you're going to be tempted to pattern the world. Perhaps you're even feeling the squeeze today. If so, stay tuned and witness one of the most effective examples of standing firm from the life of Daniel. Let's join Pastor Woodward for today's lesson on the Mini Bible College.
In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded his chief eunuch to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, handsome and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to serve in the king's palace, and to teach them the letters and language of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily portion of rich food which the king ate, and of the wine which he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief eunuch gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself. This is the way we read about another of the great prophets, the 4th of the major prophets, and the 3rd of the captivity prophets, so-called, Daniel. When we meet Daniel, he's just 14 years old. Jerusalem has fallen, not in the final sense. We've said many times that it took about 20 years for Jerusalem to fall. The first time that it fell, it was under King Jehoiakim. He surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar, and he served Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years right there in the land of Israel, paid tribute, but it wasn't all that tragic. After 3 years, he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and the city was conquered a second time, and his little son Jehoiakim surrendered the city symbolically, and his brother Zedekiah was made a puppet king. He reigned for 11 years, and then he also rebelled, and the city was conquered again. This is the first time Jerusalem falls. And there aren't major deportations. This is not a great deportation of people to Babylon. Just a few select people, Nebuchadnezzar said. I want the nobles, and I want the princes, and I want the real sharp young men, the ones that are handsome and skillful in wisdom. I think he said, I don't want any of those priests or prophets or any of those nuts. I want the law students and the med students, and I want the sharp ones. This is what he was saying to his eunuch. Now, it was under those conditions that Daniel and his 3 friends were taken to Babylon. They were taken to Babylon in the providence of God and strategically placed in Babylon before the other captives came. Ezekiel didn't come until 9 years later, and he came before the main body of captives came. You see, God was strategically placing a ministry there in Babylon for the good of his people, so that by the time the captives came, they would have somebody in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. I think that's exciting to think that God could arrange that. But you have the beautiful story of Daniel in his book. The book of Daniel divides into 2 sections. The first 6 chapters are a narrative, an historical narrative, and then chapters 7 through 12 are prophetic revelations. When we think of Daniel, we think of the Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, and we think of Ezekiel. We put Daniel in a class with Ezekiel and John, and we should. Remember, we said John and Ezekiel and Daniel, all 3 were exiles when they wrote their books, the books that we have in the Bible written by them. And they all 3 write the same way. They write apocalyptic literature, which means they give us revelations and visions of things that we would otherwise never know. And they also write eschatological books, which means they tell us about the last things. Eschat meaning the last things. Eschatology meaning the study of the last things. They're all that kind of prophet. And Daniel 7 through 12 is that kind of prophecy, and it's very difficult. It's just as difficult as the book of Revelation, perhaps, to understand. When you say Daniel to people, most people think of those prophecies, those visions, those revelations, and they think, oh yes, just like Ezekiel and just like Daniel and just like the Revelation, it's very difficult to understand. Now the first 6 chapters of Daniel are not at all like that. You'll find the first 6 chapters of Daniel very easy to understand. They're just historical narrative, and there's much spiritual blessing in those narrative chapters of the book of Daniel. Remember, when you get into historical narrative in the Scripture, the key verse to all that historical narrative is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, which says, "All these things happen to them for examples, and are written down as a warning for you and me, upon whom the ends of the world are come." This means that as these people give us historical narrative, we're being given examples and warnings. So in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, look for examples and warnings, and you'll find plenty of both. Now Daniel, of course, is a superb example. Daniel and Joseph are the purest characters in the Word of God. So many Bible characters have their plus and their minus. Especially when you read about them in the New Testament, you just see the plus signs, but when you go back in the Old Testament, you see the minus signs. In the New Testament, they're not remembered for their sins or their failures. They're remembered for their successes. But when you go back in the Old Testament, you see that their spiritual life was like a spiritual roller coaster. They had their ups and their downs. Well, that's not true of Joseph, and that's not true of Daniel. Daniel is a pure biblical character. He went to Babylon when he was 14. He lived his entire life in a hostile culture. He lived his entire life in Babylon. He outlived Nebuchadnezzar and his son Belshazzar. He outlived Darius the Mede, and he lived into the reign of Cyrus the Great. He lived through the entire 70-year period of the Babylonian captivity. He was too old and feeble to come back with the captives, but he did see them go back. And it was his role and function to show them how to cope with captivity. He coped with captivity in a magnificent way, even when he was 14 years old. Now, when he gets to Babylon, it doesn't take him long to realize that the squeeze is on. In the Phillips translation of Romans 12, it says, "Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold," which means the squeeze is on, whether you know it or not. There's a constant pressure to conform to this world. And the Scripture tells us, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold, but let God remold you from within, and you be different. That's an exhortation to believers in the New Testament period. And the same thing was true of Daniel when he got to Babylon. Here he is, a 14-year-old, early teenage Jewish boy, and the first confrontation he finds is that when he's been conscripted for the university there of Babylon, and he's being trained with the wise men, Nebuchadnezzar, to be one of the wise men of Babylon, the first issue is the rich food, which probably included pork and all kinds of things that were unclean for him as a Jewish young man. And it says he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Now it's interesting when you read this narrative that as soon as they get to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar changes the names of these young men. All of them had names that meant something about God. Anytime you have a name ending with El, that means that it has something to do with God, because the Hebrew word for God was capital E-L. The plural was Elohim, and the singular was just El. So when you have Daniel, Mishael, you know that that name has something to do with God. Daniel's name meant God is my judge. And Mishael meant who is like God. His parents probably felt Mishael is like God. If a name ends with AH, it probably also has something to do with God because of the other words for God, like Jehovah. Hananiah means Jehovah was favored. The day he was born, Jehovah was favored. And Azariah meant helped by Jehovah. Now the first thing the Babylonians did was change the names of these Hebrew teenagers. Daniel's name was changed to Belshazzar, which meant Bel, protect his life. Bel was a pagan Babylonian god. Now here's this young man in captivity. Of course he's praying to God, this God who is his judge, to protect him. But he's given a name, Bel, you protect him. And they're trying to tell Daniel he's going to be under the protection of the pagan god Bel. And Mishael's name was changed to Meshach, which is the word Marduk in Babylonian, which is a Babylonian god. Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach, which was the moon god of Babylon. And Azariah's name was changed to Abednego, which meant servant of the Babylonian god of wisdom. You see, what Nebuchadnezzar was saying to these young men was, right up front, we're going to make Babylonians out of you. Now here's where these young men become superb examples for us. These teenagers stand up to Nebuchadnezzar and the whole Babylonian Empire, and they say, you're not going to make Babylonians out of us. We're going to make believers out of you. Boy, is that an example. You see, in your life and mine today, the pressure's on. You've got two kinds of people, really. You've got Babylonians and believers. And really, the Babylonians are trying to make Babylonians out of the believers. And the believers should be trying to make believers out of the Babylonians. So we have a good example here in the book of Daniel in the lives of these four teenagers. The miraculous thing is that the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel tells us that Nebuchadnezzar, who was the genius that put together this great Babylonian empire, which was a world power, Nebuchadnezzar professes faith in God. That's what the 4th chapter of Daniel is all about. One of the most magnificent chapters in all the Word of God is Daniel chapter 4. It's written by Nebuchadnezzar. At a certain point, someone else has to take over, and then he takes over again for obvious reasons when you read the chapter. But that is the profession of faith of Nebuchadnezzar. He professes faith in the God of Daniel and his 3 friends. And what brought him to that point? It was all started back there when Daniel didn't want to defile himself with the impure foods, with the unclean foods, and he took the stance, you're not going to make a Babylonian out of me. By the grace of God, I'm going to make a believer out of you. Now another confrontation came up very early in the game for Daniel and his friends. Nebuchadnezzar liked these 4 boys, and one night he had a dream. And he apparently had a lot of dreams, and he was a world figure. If you get into ancient history, you realize how great this man was and how great his Babylonian empire was. I put in your notes a description, a paragraph, describing just the city of Babylon as it was in that day, and the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, just to give you some idea of the grandeur of this man, the greatness of this man as the world counts greatness. Now he had a dream, and he was greatly troubled by the dream, and he called in his wise men. He had astrologers and all kinds of magicians and things, and he called these people in. And Nebuchadnezzar was a wise old emperor. He said, you know, I've always suspected that you guys are a bunch of phonies. Now I've had a dream that I really have to have interpreted. And so I'm going to put it to you this way. Tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll know that your interpretation is coming to me supernaturally. So tell me what I dreamed, then interpret it. Well, this gave them a tremendous problem. See, you know, it isn't difficult to interpret dreams. I majored in psychology, and I had several courses in dream analysis. So frankly, I can interpret any dream that you have. If you've had a dream, you just ask me, and I can interpret it. Now, you know, we have all these symbols and ways that we do it. You know, the psychiatrist Jung was real big on this. Jung and Adler were big on this. So you just ask me, you know, to interpret your dream, and I will. Now, if you ask me, how do I know that your interpretation's the right interpretation? Well, then I'll say, well, I went to college, and you have my word for that. This is the right interpretation of the dream. See, the big catch is, how do you know my interpretation's right? Well, Nebuchadnezzar faced that. And he'd probably faced it before. So he said to these wise men of Babylon, I'm going to really put you to the test. If you have a hotline, if you really do have some clairvoyant powers, tell me what I dreamed, then interpret it. Well, when he said that, they really just did body slams. They just, you know, really got upset. And they said to Nebuchadnezzar, no king has ever asked anything so unreasonable. And they said something very significant in responding to his unreasonable demand. They said, no man could ever do that unless the gods lived in men. And everybody knows the gods don't live in men. Well, Nebuchadnezzar said, if you don't tell me what I dreamed and interpret my dream, I'm going to have you torn limb from limb and have your houses dragged until they're just a pile of rubble. You're all going to be put to death. Well, the executioner actually came over to the university, and he was going to put to death all of these professors, all these wise men, and their students. Well, that included our 4 young men, because they were enrolled in the university. And when the executioner actually arrived to put them to death, Daniel spoke up with great wisdom and tact, just a teenager now, and he says, "Why is the decree of the king so severe?" And he begins to talk to this executioner. And when the executioner said, "Well, the king and your wise men kind of had a disagreement," the wise men said that gods don't live in men, and so we're not gods. We can't tell you what you dreamed. Daniel said, but that's where they're wrong, because God does live in men. And he said, "I'll tell you what you do. Don't kill all these people here. You go to the king and make an appointment for me. I'm going to tell him what he dreamed, and I'm going to interpret it." Well, then he turns to his three friends, and they say, "Daniel, do you know what he dreamed?" And he says, "I haven't got a clue what he dreamed." He said, "We better have a prayer meeting." So they have an all-night prayer meeting, and they pray, and while they're praying, it says, in the night, God reveals supernaturally to Daniel Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the interpretation. And so it's just beautiful in the narrative there. He goes into the presence of the emperor. And the emperor says, "Young man, I understand that you can tell me what I dreamed." And Daniel says, "No, sir, I can't. There isn't a man on earth that can do that, but there's a God in heaven who can. There's a God in heaven, and he does live with men. That's where your wise men are wrong. And this God who's in heaven, who also lives in me, he's told me what you dreamed, and he's told me how to interpret it." And then he says, "Nebuchadnezzar, this is what you dreamed, and this is the interpretation." Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, and from that day forward he always referred to Daniel as the man in whom the Spirit of God lives. The man in whom the Spirit of God lives. Belshazzar, who followed Nebuchadnezzar, referred to Daniel that way. The queen in Belshazzar's day referred to Daniel that way. And even Darius the Mede referred to Daniel as the man in whom the Spirit of God lives. See, Daniel convinced them that it was true. Now, isn't he an example for you and me, and a challenge for you and me? Do you believe that the Spirit of God lives in you? Well, if he does, what does that mean? Does that mean you have the capacity for the miraculous? Let me give you a little spiritual pop quiz. I'd like to ask you some questions, and you just answer them to yourself. Do you believe that with God nothing is impossible? Do you believe that if you have faith in a crisis situation that nothing is impossible for you? Do you believe that if God is in us and with us, that all things are possible? Do you believe that all things are possible to the man that believes that God is in him and with them? Well, I hope you answer that yes or affirmatively to all of those questions, because there are verses in the Bible to substantiate an affirmative answer to every one of those questions. The first person to question the virgin birth was the virgin. And when she questioned the virgin birth, you know what she was told? With God, nothing will be impossible. And when the apostles couldn't heal a man's son, and they asked the Lord why they were unable to heal him, the reply of Jesus was, "It's your unbelief. If you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, nothing shall be impossible unto you." The apostles were asked how they could save a man, and Jesus said, "With men it's impossible, but not with God. With God all things are possible." And when that man whose son was ill said to Jesus, "If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us," Jesus said, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him that believeth." I wonder, as we continue the quiz, have you ever faced pressures and problems that were absolutely inescapable, unavoidable, intolerable, and impossible? I asked a man that question one day. I said, "Have you ever faced anything that was unavoidable, inescapable, intolerable, and impossible?" And he said, "Yes, I look across the breakfast table every morning at somebody who's inescapable, unavoidable, intolerable, and she's absolutely impossible." Well, maybe you face that kind of pressure every morning when you wake up. Most people face those things when they come into a crisis situation. Now, Daniel was in a crisis situation, and it faced him with that which was inescapable. He couldn't escape. He was going to be killed. Everybody in that university was going to be killed by Nebuchadnezzar. It was unavoidable, inescapable. The thought of being torn limb from limb, I'm sure, was intolerable. And when Nebuchadnezzar gave them that challenge and said, "Tell me what I dreamed," and then interpreted it, that presented him with the impossible. But when Daniel was challenged with those things, Daniel made an appointment with Nebuchadnezzar, and then he had his prayer meeting and asked God to do the impossible. You see, Daniel becomes an example for us, and you'll find 5 miracles recorded in the book of Daniel, which illustrate not just the miraculous, the fact that there is such a thing as a supernatural, but these 5 miracles that happen in the book of Daniel, which are this vision that he supernaturally has revealed to him, the rescue of his 3 friends from the fiery furnace, the profession of faith of Nebuchadnezzar, the handwriting on the wall there in chapter 5, and then the rescue of Daniel from the lions in the lion's den. Those 5 miracles take place in the book of Daniel to show us something about Daniel. And remember, Daniel is showing us not only faith, but he's showing us the kind of faith that can cope with Babylonian captivity. You see, in order to live in Babylon, Daniel lived his whole life. He was like a layman. He wasn't like a prophet, like Jeremiah. He was a layman. He lived his whole life in the arena of Babylonian politics. It was just as hostile a world as you could possibly live in. And he showed the people of God how to live in Babylon and keep their faith. Now, he showed them this way. Daniel believed in the power of God absolutely. Without reservation, he believed in the power of God. That's why he made that appointment with Nebuchadnezzar. He said, "The true and the living God does live in me, and because he does, I have the capacity for the impossible. I have the capacity for the miraculous." He believed in the power of God, and he believed in the power of God absolutely. Daniel believed in the power of prayer absolutely. The last of those miracles, the story of the lion's den, I think the big truth that we get from that story is this. It shows us the important place that prayer had in the life of Daniel. It also shows us the purity of Daniel as a character. You see, because of his interpretation and his identification of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he was elevated in Babylon. And then he kept doing other things and kept getting elevated until he was practically made prime minister of Babylon. And of course, they were very jealous of him. And so by the time you get to chapter 6, they're trying to put him to death. Notice, by the way, as you come through these chapters, there are different kings mentioned, and you realize you're covering a 70-year span in those first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. In the first 4 chapters, it's Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5, it's Belshazzar, which was his son. And then when you get to chapter 6, it's Darius the Mede. So you're covering a lot of history there. But they're very jealous of Daniel by the time you get to chapter 6, so they want to put him to death. They want to get something on him, and they can't get anything on him. You know, Jesus could stand in the presence of his enemies and say, "Which of you convinces me of sin?" Most of us couldn't do that. It's difficult enough for us to keep it together with our friends, but we sure can't keep the enemies happy or have a life that is above reproach to where the enemies can't even criticize us. But even Daniel's enemies couldn't get anything on him. The only thing they could get on him was this: he prays 3 times a day. He gets up there in that chamber of his, and he opens the window and faces toward Jerusalem, because remember, that's where God was, according to Daniel. And morning, noon, and night he prays. And so they, in a very subtle way, had a law the Medes and the Persians passed, that it was impossible to petition anybody for help but the king. They passed a law that couldn't be changed, saying that if anybody petitioned anybody, God or man, other than this king, for help, then they would be thrown in the lion's den. That was the only way they could get Daniel. But when the decree was passed, when the law was written, did Daniel stop praying? No, Daniel said, "You make up your mind what you're going to do to me, but I'll tell you something, folks. I can't live in Babylon and not pray." So he prays morning, noon, and night, just like he always had. And of course, that's when they have him arrested, and he's thrown in the lion's den. Well, I think that story shows us not only another one of the great miracles of Daniel, but it shows us that Daniel believed in the power of prayer absolutely. I believe we can assume that Daniel also believed in the providence and purposes of God for putting him in Babylon, and I'm sure he believed in those purposes of God for putting him there in Babylon absolutely. Now, it's in this way that Daniel is a great example to us. What an example he is to us. Just a teenager when he starts out, believing absolutely in the power of God, absolutely in the power of prayer, and absolutely in the purposes of God for putting him in Babylon. And that makes it possible for him to stand up to Nebuchadnezzar and then reach the point where he wins the friendship and he wins the position with Nebuchadnezzar to where he can actually be an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. Now I wonder, what is the devotional application to the life of Daniel? Well, I think that's very, very obvious. Do you face these pressures and problems that are unavoidable, inescapable? If you could possibly ignore them, or if you could evade them, if you could, get away from them, you would. But sometimes you face problems, a crisis, a challenge. It's unavoidable, it's inescapable. There's no way out. Sometimes these pressures are intolerable, and they present you with the impossible. Now, if you're facing something like that right now, then the devotional application of the life of Daniel is this. Do you believe in the power of God? Absolutely. Do you believe in prayer? Absolutely. Do you believe in the purposes of God for putting you in that place where you're facing these challenges? Do you believe in that? Absolutely. Well then, dare to be a Daniel. Just dare to have the faith of Daniel. You see, you're surrounded by Babylonians, and you're being bombarded by the hidden persuaders of the Babylonians. It's like a conspiracy. The world is trying to make a Babylonian out of you. They're trying to give you the values of a Babylonian and the lifestyle of a Babylonian. And they're trying to say to you, come on, be a Babylonian with the rest of us. Now the challenge presented to us by the life of Daniel and his three friends is this. Just determine in your heart, purpose in your heart that you're not going to be defiled. Purpose in your heart that they're not going to make a Babylonian out of you, and then take the offensive. Don't be content just to say, you're never going to make a Babylonian out of me, but take the offensive and say, by the grace of God, I'm going to make a believer out of you. You see, when somebody believes in the power of God absolutely, and they believe in the power of prayer absolutely, and the purposes of God absolutely, that not only keeps them from being defiled by Babylon, which is a symbol for this world, that goes further than that. That becomes a spiritual offensive. That makes believers out of Babylonians. Well, this man Daniel is perhaps the greatest of the captivity prophets, certainly the most colorful of the captivity prophets, and Daniel's example of faith as he stands there in Babylon, not only refusing to defile himself, but to convert the leader of all of Babylon, is an example for us on the pages of Scripture that's unequaled. Let Daniel's example be a challenge and an inspiration to you. Let him bring you to the place where you face your pressures and problems, absolutely believing in the power of God, and in the power of prayer, and in the purposes of God for putting you in the circumstances in which He has placed you.
Let me see if I can repeat Dick's last emphasis there. When somebody believes in the power of God, absolutely, and in the power of prayer, absolutely, and the purposes of God, absolutely, just imagine how God will use them. Well, that wraps up another day of fine teaching with Pastor Dick Woodward, and I hope you've been blessed by the presence of the Lord today as you've listened. And if you enjoyed today's program, I hope you'll join us again next time, as Pastor Dick takes us once again into a new lesson as he continues teaching us through the Bible. Thank you, and may God bless you until we meet again.